Welcome back to another IB Environmental Systems and Societies video. Today's topic is 3.4, Conservation and Biodiversity. As you can see from this tree of life diagram behind me, the diversity of species on Earth is incredible, from bacteria to fungi, plants to animals. But this diversity is under threat, which brings us to our topic today. So let's get into it. The impact of losing biodiversity drives conservation efforts because ecosystems provide essential services. These include provisioning services like food and water, regulating services like climate control, erosion control, and pollination, cultural services that enrich our lives, and critical habitat services that maintain the web of life. Different environmental value systems provide different motivations for conserving biodiversity. When we look at this diagram of carbon storage in tropical forests, we can see how an anthropocentric perspective might focus on the ecosystem service of carbon sequestration. But an ecocentric view might emphasize the intrinsic right of those forests and everything that lives in them to exist. There are several different approaches to conservation, each with its own strengths and limitations. Decision makers have to choose whether to focus on protecting individual species like this elk or on preserving entire habitats. Both of these approaches have merit, and often a combination of the two is what works best. Arguments for species and habitat-based preservation can be based on several justifications. The aesthetic value comes from beauty and inspiration. Ecological value relates to the ecosystem functions. Economic values are derived from resources and tourism. Ethical considerations might include species' rights to exist, those biorights that we encountered earlier in the syllabus. And social value encompasses cultural and community benefits to people. International organizations like the WWF or the World Wildlife Fund play really important roles in conservation. Their effectiveness varies based on several factors, including their use of media. You probably recognize this panda logo, which makes it one of the most famous logos in the entire world. And that demonstrates that the WWF has a very effectively used media. And so just by having their logo be known by people around the world, that raises people's awareness of threats to biodiversity and the efforts to conserve it. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List exemplifies how organizations contribute to conservation. It serves as the world's most comprehensive information source on species conservation status, and that helps guide biodiversity conservation efforts around the world. Organizations' effectiveness can vary wildly from one organization to another. This cartoon critiques how some NGOs might not efficiently use their resources. Successful conservation efforts require not just funding and money, but strategic application of resources to achieve outcomes that have been targeted and are meaningful. One of the international agreements that you're certain to come across in your IB ESS exam is CITES, the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. CITES created frameworks for collaboration. Since its formation in 1973, it's progressively expanded protection to more and more species, from rhinos to pangolins. Conservation approaches can be categorized into three main types. First is your habitat-based conservation strategy. Second is species-based strategies. And third is a mixed approach that combines both of the first two. Habitat approaches protect entire ecosystems. A species-based approach focuses on efforts to conserve an individual species, and a mixed approach, as you might guess by the name, combines both of those strategies into one. Designing protected areas is one of the key elements to successful efforts to conserve biodiversity. And when we design protected areas, size matters. Large areas provide more habitats, greater habitat diversity, they support more species, and really importantly, they reduce what we call the edge effect. This diagram shows how fragmenting habitat with a road, and basically splitting a larger habitat into two smaller ones, reduces the amount of core interior habitat, and it increases the edge zones, which are more vulnerable because they're exposed to human activities. The shape of protected areas also plays an important role in conservation. This diagram shows how different configurations affect habitat quality. Circular shapes maximize that interior core zone while minimizing the edge effects. Wildlife corridors between core habitat nodes or zones helps prevent isolation of populations and allows them to intermingle and interbreed and spread genetic diversity. The closer those nodes are to one another, the easier it is for populations to intermix, and therefore the more successful the conservation effort is. CITES represents one of our key species-based conservation strategies. It works through a system of permits and licenses that regulate international trade in endangered species. However, it's a voluntary agreement, and that means that enforcement can be inconsistent across different countries depending on the economic status and priorities of each of those nations. Captive breeding programs represent another species-based strategy. Here we see a California condor chick that's being fed by a human. This is an example of ex situ conservation. That means conservation off-site. While these programs can be expensive, and they're mainly feasible in more economically developed countries like the USA, they've helped save several species from extinction. Reintroduction programs face various challenges as well, as shown by this Arabian oryx release. Animals might become habituated to people during their captivity, and if that's so, then they've kind of lost the ability to fend for themselves in their natural habitat. Additionally, if their original habitat threats haven't been addressed, reintroduction success can generally be pretty low. Some species, like the giant panda, serve as what we call flagship species. These are charismatic animals that attract public attention and a lot of support. These are different from keystone species, which play really important ecological roles in their ecosystems, regardless of their public appeal. So a flagship species is important because of the awareness it brings to the public, whereas a keystone species is important because of the ecological role that it plays within the ecosystem. Sea otters exemplify a keystone species. By controlling sea urchin populations, they protect kelp forests, which in turn provide habitat for a bunch of other species. This shows how a single species can have cascading effects throughout an ecosystem. African elephants are another important keystone species. As ecosystem engineers, they shape their environment by knocking down trees and dispersing seeds, and that creates diverse habitats that support numerous other species. Beavers demonstrate how keystone species modify their environment to create new habitats, not just for themselves, but for other organisms. Their dam building activities create wetlands that support diverse communities of fish, amphibians, invertebrates, and birds, while also influencing the way that water flows through that ecosystem. Sharks are a keystone species in marine ecosystems worldwide. As top predators, they regulate prey populations and they maintain the balance within the ecosystem. Their removal or capture can trigger trophic cascades that destabilize entire food webs. Prairie dogs might seem small, but they're really important keystone species in grassland ecosystems. When they burrow underground, they aerate the soil and create habitat for other species, and their grazing patterns change the way that plant communities are formed, and they have a very significant impact on seed dispersal patterns. The success of conservation efforts often depends heavily on community support. This image of collected firewood shows a really common challenge. If the local communities don't receive benefits from conservation efforts, or they don't have alternatives to resource extraction, most protected areas are just going to continue to face ongoing threats because people aren't going to protect biodiversity if they can't put food on the table and take care of their family. The location of protected areas also significantly influences their success. Nairobi National Park provides an interesting case study. Because it's really close to the city of Nairobi, its proximity to urban development creates both challenges and opportunities for conservation, and that highlights the importance of considering human factors in protected area design. Nairobi National Park is close enough that it serves as a great educational resource, and people routinely see and interact with wildlife that they are trying to conserve. But because it's so close to the city, that also increases the incidence of people-animal conflict and incursions into places like farmlands that leads to additional conflict. You might be asked to evaluate a protected area. And if you are, you've got to consider multiple criteria, including the size, the shape, the edge effect, the corridors between protected areas, and the proximity to human populations. This map of Nepal's protected areas show how these factors influence conservation planning at a national scale. Some of these spots are nice and large and round, and they're relatively inaccessible for people. Others are quite small and isolated, and they might be surrounded by human populations, and that makes those smaller sites more vulnerable. When evaluating different approaches to protecting biodiversity, you've also got to carefully consider whether habitat-based, species-based, or a mixed approach is going to be most effective. Each situation needs careful analysis of the local conditions, the available resources, and how the local community can contribute. Conservation biology raises important questions about knowledge and action. When should we act on what we know? International organizations like WWF and Greenpeace work globally, but their effectiveness often really depends on local implementation and support at a much smaller scale. Remember that successful conservation requires understanding both ecological and social factors. And often, the best efforts to conserve biodiversity combine both species-based and habitat-based approaches that are tailored specifically to the local context. That's it for topic 3.4, conservation of biodiversity. Until next time, happy learning.